Perhaps one of the most unusual things that insects and some mites can do to plants is to cause the tissues on which they feed to make strange structures, which we call galls. So a gall is an abnormal plant growth that's caused by the action of insects or other organisms. So to be a gall, it has to be something very strange, something different than the leaf or the twig from which the tissues have been changed to make this different kind of structure. And there are other organisms that produce galls other than insects and mites. Bacterial crown gall is a very commonly talked about gall in plant pathology circles that is not all that common these days, but is something you might wish to be on the lookout for, which usually makes a generally irregular growth of undifferentiated cells, often near the base of the plant. And also a gall-like growth is often produced by certain kinds of rust fungi, such as juniper hawthorn rust or one of the relatives, that make a fruiting structure that is very unusual in its appearance and is very gall-like, that then produces spores when conditions are correct, and the fungi become these jelly-like forms, and the spores then form off this and then move to the alternate host, which might be apple or crabapple, or in this case hawthorn, where they produce another structure on the leaf, a fruiting structure. Actually, the fungi that produce these bizarre structures in the rusts are just the fungus. It's not a change in the growth form of the plant. Insects and mites can induce a different growth in the plant. And there are several kinds of insects that can produce changes in growth of plants that we would call a gall. Some of these are insects that feed by sucking on fluids, aphids, mites in particular, and we'll start with the gall-making aphids. And if we talk about gall-making aphids, if we want to get technical, there are actually two families of aphids that are involved in production of galls. There are the adelgids, which are aphids that are solely associated with conifers and usually have two different hosts. They feed on a conifer, and they might feed on another conifer, but produce galls on only one of those two hosts. And there are a small group within the true aphids, and the true aphids is a huge group, but a small group in the subfamily Erythematidae, which are some of the woolly aphids that are found on deciduous plants, also alternate between hosts, but will make a gall on one of the hosts and not the other. But the most important, or at least the most commonly encountered of the gall-making aphids in the broad sense, would be an adelgid, one of these woolly aphids on conifers, that produces a gall on spruce trees. Our state tree, the Colorado blue spruce, it also produces galls on Engelmann spruce. This is the Cooley spruce gall produced by the Cooley spruce gall aphid, or technically an adelgid. And it is a terminal distortion of the new growth. So instead of normally elongating, it becomes truncated and swollen. And the insect will develop in this, and I'll show you the developing stages of this. And it kind of looks like a cone. In this case, we see multiple Cooley spruce galls on the left, and we see a spruce cone on the right, but it is not a cone. It is a terminal growth, a twig that could have been a normally elongated twig, but instead has become a Cooley spruce gall. Now, in the wintertime, this is an insect that is associated with spruce, but it is very small and not commonly encountered. I think you can see these two small, kind of whitish and woolly objects on the underside of this spruce terminal. And that's the overwintering stage of the Cooley spruce gall aphid. It will be suspended in its development throughout the winter, but will resume growth in spring as the plant again begins to resume growth. And then as we get in mid to late spring, say April and early May, you might see it becoming quite obvious. It might grow to be the size of almost a Q-tip, say. It becomes a big woolly object. And this is not just the insect at this point. This is an insect that has produced many eggs, and the eggs are covered in a woolly covering. So this insect will produce an egg sac that contains hundreds of eggs that is produced prior to bud break. And these eggs will hatch coincident with bud break. And this is critical because only at this time of plant growth can this insect make this kind of gall. So the newly hatched nymphs will migrate to the base of the needles within the emerging buds of the spruce tree. They will settle, they will feed, and their feeding activity will induce a proliferation of cell growth, and that will form a kind of cavity around them within which they will then grow. And they will continue to grow within this cavity that's at the base of the needles. So were you to come in, say, early to mid-September, mid-June, you would see fairly large aphids within these cavities. Another section in cross view again shows that these cavities have been induced to grow at the base of the needles. So they develop within this, but when they're full grown, then the plant changes in a way that allows them to escape. The symptoms you'll first see will be little droplets of fluid around the cracks where these cavities exist, and then the plant will continue to dry down and crack open, allowing the aphids to crawl out, and then they will shed their skins and they will turn into a wing stage that will then leave that plant. So you get a wing stage that will then leave the spruce tree. And where do they go after that? Well, they leave the spruce. The spruce is abandoned for the middle of the summer. And where they go is they're going to go to Douglas fir. This is a kind of aphid that has two hosts. And the form on spruce forms a gall, and then the form on Douglas fir does not produce a gall, but it is a woolly aphid. And if you were to see a woolly aphid on the needles of a Douglas fir, that is almost always going to be the alternate form of the very same insect that made a gall on a spruce tree. On Douglas fir, it does not make a gall. They might twist the needles if you had large numbers of them early in the year, but it is not a gall producer, and much less commonly observed. Now, come midsummer, after the Cooley spruce gall aphid has left the spruce tree, the tissues on which it is developed earlier and from which it exited start to dry down, and they become quite conspicuous, and people might become concerned at this time. But the insect is no longer involved in those old galls. It will not return to them. It's not associated with them at this point in time. If you were to remove these galls, it would have no effect in terms of any incidence of this insect in the future. Because this is an insect that has two hosts, and after it leaves the spruce tree, it does go to Douglas fir. If the spruce tree is going to be reinfested, it's going to be reinfested by a totally new consort of aphids that have originated from a Douglas fir, not from the previous plant. These alternate hosts. So there are migratory forms that leave Douglas fir late in summer, and if they find a spruce tree, these wing forms return to spruce, and if they find them, they will then lay eggs that hatch and produce those overwintering, partially developed nymph stages that are the stage that survives between seasons, that little tiny woolly aphid that is indicated on the underside of the twigs in the lower right picture. That's the overwintering stage. But each year is independent, because each year the insect leaves the spruce, goes to its alternate host, and which is Douglas fir, and new ones come back to the spruce trees in the fall. So this is an insect that does have two hosts, and so if you want to avoid problems, the best way to do this is to avoid having both hosts next to each other. Here we have a Douglas fir and blue spruce planting both together. Bad idea. This would allow both stages of the insect to be completed on these two hosts, and you could expect to be having problems with high numbers of this insect. Now, the Cooley spruce gall is produced by an insect called an adelgid, a woolly aphid, and technically it is not a true aphid. That's a different family. There are true aphids that also produce galls. Most commonly, we see aphids producing galls that are on populus, cottonwoods, poplars, less commonly aspen, but some strange growth that is found on the stem, on the leaf, and perhaps on the petiole. A growth that is produced by a gall-making aphid in the genus Pemphigus on some sort of populus species. All of these leave that populus species, and all of them move to some other plant in the summer, and most of them, at least the ones that are well known, are going to be feeding on roots. So the stage of the insect that you see making a gall on the stem or on the petiole or on the leaf of a cottonwood in the spring, in the summer, where you try to find that same insect, it's on the roots of some herbaceous plant. It could be something related to lettuce. It could be something related to beets. What we see here are ones that are found on beets and quinoa, but they generally have a summer host that is a root feeding stage. Now, there are other insects that produce galls that also feed by sucking fluids, and one of these are the family Psyllidae. And psyllids tend to produce galls that are in the form of a little bump or a little pit. In this part of the country, almost always, all we see are the ones that are associated with hackberry, producing bumps or pits on hackberry. So typical forms on leaves will be a lump or a raised blister, or sometimes a pouch, usually arising from the upper leaf surface and then going down, or some will make a gall in the form of a distortion on a bud or a raised area on a twig. But again, here, if you want to find a psyllid-produced gall, look for a hackberry tree, because there are 5 species of hackberry psyllids that make galls. The most common one is the hackberry nipple gall psyllid, which makes a very large, pronounced gall on the leaf of the hackberry leaf. There is also one that is far more common, but far less commonly observed, that is called the hackberry blister gall psyllid, and all you see is just a little pimple on the leaf where this insect is developing. The adults of these insects are wintering in the near vicinity of a hackberry tree that had previously supported this insect, so they're in furrows in the bark or some other protected site in the near vicinity. They return in the spring almost as soon as buds start to emerge, and will then be laying eggs on the leaves that are being produced. So we see multiple stages in this picture. In this picture, the white one, the white arrow, indicates a larger psyllid than is indicated by the black arrow. The white arrow indicates a hackberry nipple gall psyllid. It will make a big bump on a leaf, and the smaller ones are going to make a little blister on the leaf. So, regardless of the species, these overwintered adults return to the new growth in spring to lay their eggs. And in the picture on the lower right, you can see lots of eggs being laid on these hackberry leaves. These eggs hatch, the young start to feed. Their feeding induces the plant tissues to grow in a different manner so that you get a gall. So lots of little eggs produced by hackberry blister gall psyllid. And the galls develop with the developing insect. So you will see a lump if it's the hackberry nipple gall psyllid, a little tiny blister if it's the hackberry blister gall psyllid. And were you to look at this larger one, the hackberry nipple gall psyllid, in the middle of summer, cut it open. And if you do it carefully, there will likely be visible the developing insect as indicated in the lower right here. That's the insect that it's feeding had induced these leaf tissues to grow that little home around it. It made a gall. In this case, we see a mixture of hackberry blister gall and nipple gall psyllids. The big bumps are produced by a nipple gall psyllid, but all over this leaf are blister galls, and around the base of many of the nipple galls are lots of blister galls as well. So there could be perhaps 100 or more blister galls in this image right here, and 4, 5, 6, 7 nipple galls. In this picture, I've teased out the two kinds of galls and exposed the developing nymphs that were developing in each of these. To the right is a larger hackberry nipple gall psyllid, and to the left is a hackberry blister gall psyllid. These will continue to develop in the galls were they to be undisturbed, and ultimately would emerge as some sort of adult form. And the adult forms kind of look like a cicada, a little miniature cicada. Of course, when they first emerge, they are pale. They take some time to have to harden up to become sclerotized. But then they become fully hardened up and then move off and find some place to get through the winter. Now, this is an insect that does produce galls on hackberry. In fact, it is hard to find a hackberry that does not have some kind of gall on it, produced by one kind of insect or another. And if you focus on the kind of injury that the insect does, such as indicated in the middle of this picture, you would say, oh my goodness, this is a terribly injurious kind of problem. However, if you step back and you look at some of the leaves that are in the upper part of this picture, you get a better perspective of really how much damage is being done by this insect. These older leaves are not being turned into galls. The only kinds of tissues that were turned into galls happen to be ones that were growing at the point when this insect was laying eggs. The ones that were produced before then, the ones that were produced after that point when the eggs were laid, can't be turned into galls. They're no longer sensitive to being turned into a gall. And finally, and this is going to be a big series of images, there is a very interesting group of mites that make galls called areophyid mites. And these are really tiny mites. The picture on the lower right kind of shows their general appearance. Were you to see them, they kind of look like little walking carrots, but they're very small and would need a magnification of maybe 15x to be able to see them. Far smaller than a spider mite. So areophyid mites, these little tiny elongated kind of mites, some of them live on leaves, but we're talking now about the ones that make galls. And if they are going to make galls, areophyid mites make very interesting galls. They make galls on leaves that are what we call a finger gall or a pouch gall or a blister gall, or a very unusual and unique form called an arrhenium. They will also make general distortions and twisting of twigs and buds and also flowers. So, areophyid mites, and there are many species of these, many of which are undescribed, but we see their damage. Produce galls of these kind of forms: a blister gall, an arrhenium, a pouch gall, a finger gall. Starting with the blister galls, this is a term I just used to describe a kind of gall that had been produced by a psyllid on hackberry. A blister gall, when we apply that term to an areophyid mite, it's just kind of a scabby little patch that when you tear it apart, it kind of has lots of little kind of sphagnum-like moss-like growth in the interior within which the mites are living. So it's a scabby little patch that does have a cavity within it. And the blister galls, where you see them, it's almost always going to be on some sort of palm fruit, a crab apple or apple, pear. There's also some blister galls that occur on certain kinds of walnut as well. But more common are some other kinds of gall forms that are produced by aryaphyte mites. One gall form that is unique to aryaphyte mites are a finger gall, where the leaf tissue turns into a very elongated projection of finger gall. And these are found primarily on fruit trees, such as chokecherry. That's our common native one that we have. And each of these finger galls may harbor dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of developing aryaphyte mites. There's a different finger gall that's made on American plum. And in this picture here, there's a little arrow pointing to some tiny aryaphyte mites that are within the convoluted structure that is produced within this finger gall structure. Some other plants, little leaf linden has a gall mite on it that is unique to little leaf linden. It allows you to identify this plant. Finger galls are also very common on maples in the eastern U.S., not so much here. In this part of the country, we also see what would be called a pouch gall. So a pouch gall would be more of a little bump. And it might have a little cavity on the underside, but a bump on one side. And pouch galls on willow are extremely common. There are multiple species, many undescribed. It's a poorly understood group, but regardless, there's lots of pouch gall making mites on willows. And again, were you to cut into one of these little structures here, these little bumps, and look very closely, you could see the developing aryaphyte mite. A pouch gall on box elder. On the upper leaf surface, you see a little pouch. In this case, on Oregon ash, a little pouch gall, a little raised area. Not too developed in terms of a raised area is a pouch gall that you sometimes will see on aspen. Again, aryaphyte mite cost. Then there is a kind of disorder that is produced by nothing else but aryaphyte mites, and that is an arrhenium. An arrhenium would be a distortion where the plant hairs that normally grow on the leaf surface of the plant, the affected plant, are induced to grow in great profusion. So normally they would be so widely dispersed you probably wouldn't see them with the unaided eye, but when aryaphyte mites are active, you can see them in the form of a dense patch of perhaps looks felty. If it's red, or it could be white. So we see arrhenia, which is the plural of arrhenium, probably most readily recognizable on maples. The picture on the left is an eastern maple, but the one on the right is the Rocky Mountain maple. And so just a fuzzy haze of plant hairs that makes it look velvety. And that are plant hairs that have been induced to grow on the surface of these leaves and are housing thousands and thousands and thousands of aryaphyte mites that produce that distortion. A plant that is grown to some degree is cranberry bush viburnum, and this harbors a very common mite that will make the new growth become purplish, kind of fuzzy, also a little bit of leaf distortion in this case as well. But that's an aryaphyte mite gall, and the way you would know it is aryaphyte mites versus anything else is the fine hairs that are induced to grow. It's an arrhenium. It's a little fuzzy when you look at it close, and there are lots of developing mites within it. And these arrhenia are often associated with some of the other symptoms we have already discussed. So that pouch gall on box elder, you look on the underside of the leaf, you have an arrhenium. You have that pouch gall on aspen, you look on the other side, you have a little fuzzy patch, in this case of brown hairs, that is an arrhenium. And a final case of an arrhenium that eluded me because I thought it was powdery mildew for many years is one that just grows generally on an aspen leaf. doesn't appear to do all that much damage, but were you to look at this in under some magnification, you would see that there is a fine forest of small plant hairs, and traveling within this are the erified mites that induce that leaf to make this kind of strange, unusual gall plant growth. Finally, erified mites can also induce galls on other kinds of plant tissues. Sometimes they're getting into buds and twigs. So a common bud gall affected disorder is on cottonwoods, the poplar bud gall, particularly Siouxland cottonwood, where buds become infested by these mites, and instead of normally elongate, they become very abnormal, enlarged, irregularly developing galls. And then there is one that is less commonly encountered that we see associated with conifers, including spruce, but mostly pines, and the new buds develop in a very distorted way. And finally, there are erified mites that will distort flowering structures. The two most common of the flowering structure mites that you might normally encounter would be ash flower gall mite, and this is associated with the male flowers of ash trees, particularly green ash. So these flowers of the ash tree are normally produced and live very little time. They flower and produce pollen normally for a couple of weeks, but if ash flower gall mite is around, they will develop in that developing ash flower and turn it into a very strange, very different looking structure that will persist throughout the summer, and you may not even see it until the leaves fall off. And another one, a final one, would be the cottonwood catkin gall mite, which develops on the developing catkins of various populus, producing a structure that is grossly enlarged and much different from the underlying catkin, and may be several inches long, so much different in form, and would be housing thousands and thousands of mites in all the little cavities that are formed here. So these are generally disorganized growths that are produced by erified mites. Just want to end with one note, and that is that there is actually an erified mite that has been introduced into the Rocky Mountain West to assist in control of a pest, field bindweed. And if it is successful in terms of its damage to a plant, you will see, as in the upper right picture, a kind of twisting and distortion of the new growth. That's the injury that the bindweed mite produces. It is widely distributed now, doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot of impact on field bindweed, one very tough weed, but is one actor that is now out in the landscape throughout this part of the country and is having some impact. Let us hope it has more impact than the bindweed does, which is, of course, one of the most pernicious kind of weeds we have. Anyway, so the aphids, the adelgids, or the true aphids, the psyllids, and the erified mites are all gall-producing arthropods that feed by sucking on fluids. And the next section, I just want to go through and introduce you to the ones that develop galls that have chewing mouthparts, the flies and the wasps. So, gall forms produced by erified mites: finger gall, pouch gall, blister gall, and arrhenium. They're on twigs or buds, a general twisting or distortion, and on flowers, an enlargement and generalized distortion. But let us move on to the next group.